Hello and welcome to another lesson online for the Elizabethan England course. This topic is the age of exploration, asking the question and then answering the question, why did Elizabeth want to explore the world and how is it possible? So a couple of sort of mini topics within the topic on this one, but it will also link to future topics when we are going to look at the Spanish Armada, why the Spanish Armada failed, and also the causes of the Spanish Armada. So important, but also really interesting as well. And if you're watching it as a revision lesson, then hopefully you'll know all of that anyway as well, and this can just tie up a few loose ends for you. So let's crack on with this topic and find out, firstly, why she wanted to go to the Americas. Alright, so reason one, and I suppose you could look at this if you make your notes in your books or whatever you're writing your notes on from this video, in several parts, paragraphs if you like. Always try and look at these things, how it might appear in your exam, either as a 2 marker, a 12 marker or a 16 marker. So we sort of think about reason one, if there was a reason, explain why Elizabeth wanted to colonize the Americas, or something along those lines, then paragraph one or reason one could be her desire to expand trade. Okay, so before we even get into this really, just let's have a think about the current situation of trade in Europe at the moment. Just pause the video and just write one sentence discussing what you know about trade, what is England's biggest export, where is our biggest market, things like that. Hopefully that'll be nice and easy. And then when you're ready, unpause the video and come back and we'll carry on. Okay, so as we know, and hopefully you've just written this down, that England has heavily relied on Antwerp over the years as our one and only or main market for export, especially our export of wool. We know also from previous topics that this trade embargo in 1563, because Elizabeth indirectly helped the Dutch Protestants, led to England suffering massively economically. So there's a reason straight away. Elizabeth is clearly thinking she needs to improve the market situation. So, if for want of a better term, not putting all of our eggs into one basket. All right, so we need to expand our opportunities, and that means finding new markets as well as that in the New World or in the Americas, new products as well. So she also says in this little speech bubble, but essentially what we're getting at is that we need to compete. England needs to be able to compete with European powers. I suppose the beginnings of capitalism maybe, or just the idea that England is a small country, it needs to, or maybe Elizabeth sees it's got more potential. So one other reason why we might want to expand trade is to compete with the other European powers and build England to be in something a little bit bigger and maybe one day a little bit more important than just a small island surrounded by superpowers. This idea about empire, obviously, as you know from your studies in Key Stage 3, Britain goes on eventually to be the biggest empire the world has ever seen. Essentially, that's saying that the British Empire, the sun never sets anywhere on the empire. So at some point in the world, it was daytime. That's how big the British Empire went on to be. The roots, arguably, could be traced back to Elizabeth's trade expansions. So John Hawkins and Sir Francis Drake, we'll meet these two in a lot more detail in the next couple of lessons. And obviously, as you're revising this, if you're revising this, then you'll know who they are very well already. So they're talking about crops and animal skins and hides and all these new metals that they've discovered in their own little adventures around the world, especially in the Americas. So that is, I suppose, allowing Elizabeth to think, well, let's go to the Americas and start there. There is one tiny little problem, though, with going to the Americas, as we'll see as this lesson goes on, is that Spain have almost certainly monopolized South America already. Their empire is massive out there, so if we are starting to venture into the Americas, we could find ourselves in a little bit of trouble as we maybe enter or get too close to Spanish waters. And of course, as I'm sure you can imagine, that is what plays out as we go through the next couple of lessons. All right, so before we move on to the actual how she's going to get some money for this, hopefully that explains quite nicely why expanding trade would be a good paragraph or a good reason why Elizabeth might want to in the first place. I mean, she could just stay in England forever and rely on Antwerp, couldn't she? But she's not daft, as we know, and it's quite obvious that doing that is never going to be a good idea in the long run. So from this little speech bubble, just pause the video and summarise what are the two main reasons for Elizabeth seeking new markets and products, and what new products has she heard of. Answer that in full sentences. You might want to start with something like, the first reason Elizabeth had for seeking new markets and products to sell was, and then put your information in there. As well as that, she also felt it would be beneficial to add a bit more there. And some of the products she had heard of from Drake and Hawkins was. So there's a little writing frame if you need it. And then when you're ready, unpause and we will carry on. Okay, so how is she going to fund this exploration and conquest? Although conquest might be quite a strong word at this point, it is probably fair to begin the roots of conquest. As we know from the British Empire, that becomes England and Britain's main plan, really, in the 18th century. So how? The clue is this photograph. When you see this photograph, hopefully you're aware of what Dragon's Den is. TV show where somebody will go on there, pitch their idea and ask for money off of these rich dragons. They will ask them loads of questions. Basically what they're trying to get is investment. So that's your clue into how she's going to fund this new exploration, because she doesn't necessarily want to pay for it herself. Bear in mind as well that we know that the English economy isn't great with all of the other problems going on. So she definitely cannot afford to pay for these explorations herself. So she's going to try and get some investment. Okay, so let's have a little look how that might work. Obviously, you know, at the court, there are really important people milling about, hobnobbing. So that might be a good place for her to start, to try and seek out investors, or maybe seek out people that she can invest in them who are regular explorers. She might say, for example, well, I'll give you £100 just for argument's sake, just for example, and I would like 10% of whatever you make on your next journey, and that kind of thing. So that thing's going on all over the place at the court. Loads of nobles are investing in other explorers, and that's the gist of it really in its simplest forms. So Elizabeth and her courtiers are investing their own money into some of these voyages. Whilst risky, the rewards are huge. Now, when we talk about rewards being huge, that might link us back to our previous topics in Key Stage 3, the Atlantic slave trade. And we'll have a little talk about that in a sec. But that's where you can see the rewards. And obviously, you remember that topic. Hopefully, people invested heavily into the merchants and the sailors, possibly asking no questions about why they got such good profits back. But probably people knew, but the potential of so much profit swayed a lot of people's minds. So Elizabeth is sure that there'll be much to discover in the Americas. So she's very much now open-minded to the idea. She's getting loads of cool stories from some of her main sailors. Some of these people visit the court and they tell stories about what they've seen, this exciting, exotic new world, heat and plants and flowers and all sorts of stuff. It gets people excited, and so that might be a reason why they might want to invest into these future missions. So, having just mentioned the Atlantic slave trade, just pause the video and write down as much as you can remember about that, about how it worked, what did they do with the Africans when they got into the Americas, what were the trade-offs, what did they swap and buy and barter, and just see if you can get yourself a little bit of a recap on that to understand why this new world, this new market, is the beginnings of something obviously really horrific, but as we've said, the rewards were huge. Okay, so this is the triangular trade image that we hopefully you've just remembered quite easily. So from Europe to Africa, they would take all sorts of different supplies, iron goods, guns, whatever, and they would trade them with some African tribes, villages, for Africans, other Africans, and of course they would be taken over to the Americas or the Caribbean, sold at the auctions and bought by plantation owners, and they would then go on to work in the fields producing cotton and all of those other things. So hopefully you remembered that. And then of course with that, profits, huge profits, because we've sold the Africans for a lot of money, and then we get the raw materials from the Caribbean and from the Americas, raw materials of cotton. We bring those things back to Europe, and of course this is the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, where the factories in the north of England managed to use those raw materials into obviously factories producing all sorts of textiles. Again, building up the empire. It all directly relates back to this point in English history where Elizabeth begins exploring the Americas. So also as well, a little link back to the medicine course. Remember in the Renaissance, we talked about some of the new herbs that were brought back. Even though herbs were used in the Middle Ages, they're clearly used in the Renaissance as well. New herbs, new things that we could use, or the apothecaries could use, all thanks to this trade that is about to bloom. So who is this Sir John Hawkins guy that you can see on the screen? So he's one of Elizabeth's main sailors, pirates, maybe for want of a better word. He was knighted for his efforts against the Armada, so we know that he's going to become really, really important, especially as our lessons go on into the Spanish Armada. But he's also really, really influential and important as a navigator, a slave trader, and in the English Navy. He gives Elizabeth lots of advice, and this is really critical. So just think really carefully what I'm telling you now. One of the things that he advises Elizabeth on is to build smaller, more maneuverable ships. Now, in the next few lessons, or if you're using this as a revision lesson, you cannot underestimate how important that is for the Spanish Armada and why England wins the Spanish Armada, particularly in that storm that we're going to talk about. Those ships being smaller and more maneuverable, they prove to be an absolute godsend. So John Hawkins deserves an awful lot of credit in that sense, in asking Elizabeth to build smaller ships. Having the foresight to see why that might be useful is really, really, really important. All right. So also he brings with him loads of profits. He brings with him loads of money. He brings loads of stories. And of course, everyone at the court, they start talking to Hawkins and they're like, oh, I want a piece of this. Let me have a bit of this. I'll invest so much money into your next journey if I can have this much back. And he also brings these really exotic things home, like ginger, again, used in medicine, animal hides. These are new things that we can sell. So we've now not only got new markets, we've also got new products to sell as well. And of course, sugar, pearls, and tobacco. Again, tobacco plays its part in the medicine course as well, doesn't it? The profits for him and his investors are huge, and basically people are lining up to invest into John Hawkins. There's some risk, obviously, in these things, as with any investing that you may go on to do in your lives. In this case, the risk might be getting into bothered in Spanish waters, ships sinking, weather, all sorts of things where you've invested in John Hawkins and he never makes it home, perhaps. But so far, so good. He is renowned for being an excellent sailor. All right, so just a little bit of extra detail there into the beginnings of this process, and again, the reasons why people may have wanted to invest, and also, just as we're mentioning, reasons why Elizabeth might have wanted to embark on a conquest of a new market, or the New World, in America in this case. All right, so paragraph 3, or reason why. Reason 3 why people might want to go on these missions, if you like, is simply adventure. Now, think about the scene. You are a poor farmer or peasant in King's Lynn or anywhere. Life, the potential for life isn't that great. You know, you see the next 40 years, if you're lucky, doing the same mundane things. Or also, you might even just be a noble child or a middle-class child, and you just can't really see any excitement by staying in England. Well, the opportunity here is extremely exciting, isn't it? Some of you, before you go to university, or if you go at all, you might take a gap year. Many young people, they go on their travels, don't they? They go travelling before they begin settling down. So in a way, it's kind of the same thing, isn't it? So people saw the New World or the Americas as an adventure. Many young Elizabethans, especially from the gentry and the nobility, because clearly they've got the money to do that, they go on these voyages of discovery in the hopes of making their own fortunes and just having a little bit of adventure. They hear the stories about the Native American Indians, they hear the stories about the white sandy beaches, the tropical trees, all of these things, and perhaps some of them might be a little bit exaggerated, but it sounds really, really exciting. So that is another reason, and the third reason why people may well want to explore the Americas and the world. All right, it's quite a nice little paragraph. Although there's not an awful lot for you to see on the screen, you could embellish a paragraph a little bit on that, couldn't you? Okay, so let's move on to the reason why it was possible, or many reasons. So one of the best ways to do this, possibly to do your notes and make sure that they make a little bit of sense to you, is as we go through the lessons, is we just annotate. So the image on the screen now is quite a nice image for you to start with, or you can draw a little boat if you want with those headings. And as we go through the next couple of slides, just add some detail, some bullet points to these green circles, and hopefully you'll have a nice little annotated image by the end. And then also that can be a useful little revision task as well, to turn that into some flashcards, or just use it as a general revision aid to turn into a paragraph. Okay, so we've talked about why they might want to go. Now let's have a little look at how it was possible to go. And we're going to look particularly at ship design, navigation tools, and maps. Obviously that's going to make it easier, so we can see straight away, without the detail, that our ships are going to have improved sails, bigger sizes. Obviously that means we can get more cargo on there. It goes without saying, as the slave trade goes on, Bigger ships equal more Africans and so forth, but also more supplies to bring home to be able to sell. Navigation is going to improve as well. It's going to become much more mathematical and technology. So remember, into the medicine course, one of the factors that we talk about a lot is technology. Did technology help medicine improve? So in this case, technology is definitely going to help navigation to the New World. Now, obviously, we don't have GPS in the 1500s, so we're going to have some technology or some tools that probably as close as we're going to get to that. And then maps offer greater accuracy and they're a bit more standardized. We'll talk about that in a second. Obviously, you can add a little bit more detail, but it's really helpful having a map, isn't it? Otherwise, you are essentially sailing off into the wilderness, not knowing what's going to happen, and maybe relying on God a little bit. So the three green circles you can see there are obviously the reasons why, and that could be, if we're thinking about the exam again, explain why exploration was possible in the Elizabethan period. Paragraph 1, ships. Paragraph 2, navigations. And paragraph 3, the maps. Okay, so let's start with new technology. All right, so you can see on the screen now some images of technology. Usually, clearly at the time, we haven't got computers and all that kind of stuff relating to the stars. Now, if it works for Mary and Joseph trying to find somewhere for baby Jesus to sleep in when they follow the North Star, then perhaps it can work for these Elizabethans as well. So let's get into the detail of it. These inventions are going to allow for longer and more accurate voyages using stars. Now, astrology, as we've seen in the medicine course, is a bit of a topic in the Middle Ages. They used it generally to, I guess, decide how to treat people and whether or not they were going to treat people. So it's still playing quite a part in the Elizabethan period as well, into the Renaissance. Of course, in this period, it's far more scientific anyway. There's a genuine search, isn't there, for answers and better science and the improvements where that comes. So this is no different here. So the fact that we can now go longer, but also have more accurate journeys, is really going to be helpful in the long run. So these journeys are recorded and then printed using the printing press. Here we go again with the printing press. It seems to play quite a part in our exams, doesn't it? So recorded by the sailors, they write it down, obviously, they come back, they formalise their writing, and then of course they can make many copies. So if you wanted to go back to, I don't know, let's say Virginia, as we'll talk about Virginia shortly, you've now got a route, you've now got the issues with that route based on previous journeys, and you just pass that on to future sailors as well. So we really are getting very much standardised here. So all that considered and all that said, this precision in the navigation is helped by this. So the astrolabe is one of the first modern pieces of technology that is going to be a circular instrument used by sailors. So they line up with the horizon, which you can see as far as you can see the horizon. So that will be the ocean. And they'll turn the astrolabe to face presumably the North Star or a star. Remember, we've got the star signs, haven't we? So they generally are the same wherever you look in the sky. And they follow that. So they set course in their ships using those degrees, and hopefully that will keep them on course. So these methods are, as we've said, published in books. In 1584, it was really simple to accurately calculate the directions of a ship using the astrolabe. So now people who maybe were a bit doubtful in investing in previous journeys because the ships never came back or whatever it might be, they're feeling much more confident now in investing into these voyages, due to the fact they're going to be much safer, more direct, and of course more direct means more faster, which means back and forth, which means of course ultimately more money. All right, and then another piece of technology would be the quadrant, which is similar to the astrolabe but in the shape of a quarter circle. Again, we're using though the idea of the horizon and the stars equally the same, and that's one reason. So this is quite a nice little paragraph, really, really technical. And if you're not really into ships and stuff, you might not particularly be interested in this enough to be excited about writing about it. But if you know about these things and you can just bring in the astrolabe and horizon and stars, you should generally be able to have a nice paragraph about why it was possible and more direct, more safe and faster, and of course more accurate. Okay, so that's one of the reasons to help us get there as well. So that's one of our circles. So add this detail around the first little green circle if you set up your notes in that way. Okay, so next is maps, which obviously directly relates to the astrolabe and other things that we've said. But to be honest, this might come as a bit of a surprise that maps before weren't really there. They were hand drawn. Of course, there's always been some sort of map, but they're hand-drawn based on some of these experience and kind of obviously working out the borders of lands that they find. Clearly, we've known about Christopher Columbus discovered the Americas in 1492, so there's always been explorers all the way back into the Middle Ages, really. In fact, all the way back, the Vikings, they explored a lot. But actually, maps that we might recognise today, this is what's developed in this period, which obviously has helped with the accuracy of the journeys. So the improved navigation and records of the voyages has led to more accurate maps being drawn. The Mercator map is what is used now, really, the invention of that, which uses longitude and latitude lines. This allows you to obviously use your astrolabes to plot where lands were, follow the lines as you may not, well, you wouldn't have been able to before. So now we've got this map with these longitude and latitude. It's much easier to do the calculations, I suppose, if you like, meaning that they have more realistic maps and their voyages therefore are, again, safer, quicker, more direct, rather than going the long way, if you like. The sooner we get back, the sooner we sell and get more investment, and the cycle carries on. So as well as this, important about standardizing the maps is we've got our printing press again. So once a map has been drawn, once a Mercator map has been created, if you did it by hand each time, it may well be similar, but it just takes one tiny little mistake, one island, one line to be slightly wrong. And of course, the next journey is going to be off by miles. By the time you get to where you're going, even 1 degree could be miles and miles off your target. So now that you can do it once and put it through the printing press, it means every single map is exactly the same, meaning every single journey should be exactly the same as well. So again, quite a nice, easy paragraph really in saying why it was possible. So just add this little bit of information and essentially what I'm telling you into your second green circle, and we will look at the last one. Ship design. Okay, so before we go any further, just in case you didn't know, if maybe you're not a geographer, longitude and latitude are the lines just to show you north and south, east and west. Okay, so ship design next, our final sort of area for this lesson in trying to understand how that's helped us do these voyages. Remember Hawkins discussed with Elizabeth that she should invest in smaller ships, which will come to some success later on. But for now, if you just have a little look at this image, and maybe just draw this image with the labels, or if it's on Google Classroom, then it will be in your Google Classroom post as well. So we can see that these ships are a bit lower, more sails, the aft castle and the stern, and there's cannons. So it's quite a standard ship, if you like. The triangular sail is what's new here. Now, it might seem really simple to us, or maybe not at all. You may be looking at that thinking, I don't know. But in essence, in its simplest form for this course and for you to understand some detail, that triangular sail makes it much easier to steer the ship, as well as the fact that the ship is going to be much lower into the water. So if the waters do get a bit choppier, then there's more control of the ship. I suppose think about that if you are into Formula 1, you can see those cars are really fast, but they're really low to the ground, which helps when they're going around corners fast, just helps with that stability and maneuverability. If the ships were taller in the air, in the sea, and it's really choppy, then obviously it makes it probably much easier for the ships to keel over. So being lower down and into the water is a genius design. Okay, so we're now going to go through the rest of this lesson, and you're going to add some bits about ship design in detail, so the stuff that you'll need in a paragraph on how ship design has helped the exploration. But also please keep in mind this information for the Spanish Armada. When we talk about why England won, then these ships designed the way that they were could play some part when it comes to those 1-to-1 battles during the Armada. So let's see then. So add the information as we go onto your little green circles, or however you're presenting it. This is how the new ships helped Elizabethan exploration. So firstly, loads of new shipyards. So there's an investment in building ships. Luckily, you could say, because obviously the Spanish Armada is going to require ships to defeat them. Maybe you could argue that this was a preemptive decision by the government to start building ships, or maybe it was just by, I don't know, merchants, explorers, who just knew that there was a lucrative new world out here. Business was booming, so they just decided to build more shipyards. Anyway, more shipyards means more ships. They're also more stable, and they're bigger, which means we can go for longer because you can get more supplies, more food, and obviously when you're coming back with larger ships, as we've previously said, you have more items to sell. Lower forecastles and aft castles, so at the back, as we've already just mentioned on the previous page, means much more stable in rough seas, meaning that you can carry on with your journey rather than perhaps having to anchor, losing time, and in this case, time definitely is money. All right. Also, you get more cargo, be it Africans later on or just now, more sugar, more tobacco, more ginger, more herbs, more spices, whatever it might be. More cargo means more profit. Dead simple, really. And then obviously, if they're faster and more maneuverable because of the sail types, that triangular sail, we can again increase our profit because we are doing more journeys. We're getting there and back much quicker. And you in the court or wherever you're getting these investments from are loving life, and everybody else is loving life too. So there is a real reason to give credit to the design of the ships that perhaps in the long run is maybe one of the reasons why the British Empire grew to be so successful. There are also more masts and more sails, which allow for longer, faster and more accurate voyages. Again, we keep saying this is about more journeys equals more profit. So obviously, if you're into ships and you understand how this works, then it's really easy. But for everyone else who isn't, a lot more sails mean you can change the direction of them, the angles of them, absolutely depending on the direction of the wind. If the wind changes, then you just change your masts and your sails and you keep going. Okay, whereas before, perhaps less sails or not quite so maneuverable sails means you generally had to pause your journey or risk being shipwrecked. All right, and then better firepower as well, and this definitely will play a part in a couple of lessons' time. Better firepower due to the cannon technology on the gun decks, which we'll talk about later, allowed for good defences. If you come into some pirates on your journey, which as you approach the Americas, as we've said, in South America particularly, which Philip has got, his empire is South America, you're going to need to be able to fight and evade or defeat, or even, if you wish, to board those ships yourself if you wanted to attack them. So having better firepower is definitely going to be a thing that's going to help these journeys, more so in defence really, but if you really were feeling brave enough, as we'll see with Sir Francis Drake shortly, then yeah, you could also do a bit of robbing while you're out there. Okay, so ship design is probably the easiest paragraph, because if you just remember a few of these things and keep alluding to the idea that it allows more journeys equals more profit. All right, so with that said, a sort of new lesson, but within this online lesson, is let's get our head around this guy. Okay, so Sir Francis Drake is going to be really, really important in almost all answers that you write, be it 12 marker, 16 marker, or a 2 marker on him himself. It'd be a bit of a waste if it's only a 2 marker, but you're going to get to know Sir Francis Drake really, really well. It's going to be an answer for any paragraph. Just see him now as we go through this lesson as a paragraph in England's exploration, a paragraph in why the Armada won, a paragraph in why relations broke down, why did England end up going to war with Spain. You'll see very, very soon that Sir Francis Drake is definitely one of the reasons. But for now, we're just going to focus on 1577 to 1580, all right? So we know from previous lessons and this course that the 70s getting a little bit hairy in the way of Catholic threats. The economy is obviously not doing too great. So Sir Francis Drake is going to be doing a little side hustle, if you like, trying to bring some money and wealth back to England. He is ultimately England's probably most famous sailor ever. He's a pirate. Remember we talked about in the education lesson, lots of young children where we're learning to read. They were hearing stories of Sir Francis Drake, swashbuckling, pirates, stealing Spanish gold. All of these things really excited people in the story. So with that said, let's get a little bit of detail. So on your notes, just maybe put who is Francis Drake and a couple of bullet points, but we'll get some depth to this character as well. He is definitely really important. Okay, so the aims of Sir Francis Drake, and keeping in mind now, we could add this to a bit of a ongoing question about who's responsible for the war. Is it England, is it Elizabeth, or is it Philip? Is it a bit of both? Certainly Elizabeth employing and encouraging Francis Drake to do some of the things that he does. It's really, really clear to see how she could probably be blamed for some of this. Anyway, Drake's aims are to raid Spanish colonies. So to go into Spanish colonies in the Americas, in South America, raid them, steal from them, and get out of there. Obviously, that's going to provoke Philip. It's going to make Philip angry. But that's his job. He's a pirate. Also, Drake is motivated quite a lot by revenge. In 1568 at San Juan de Lula, killing 325 of his sailors, he only came home with 15. So overall, he's never quite forgot this grudge. A bit of a disaster for Drake and Hawkins earlier on, when they come up against the Spanish and essentially came home losing everything, whether they had investors on that journey or not, who wouldn't be happy. So Drake's aims are motivated largely in some revenge for that attack in 1568. So he's held on to that grudge for clearly over 10 years. He also is there to make maximum profits for himself, his courtiers, and of course Elizabeth. All of these people who have invested in Drake, he's the best, so obviously he can make the best deals. A little bit like that link to the Dragon's Den at the start of this lesson. If you want the best dragon, you may take slightly less money because you know he's the best, or whatever negotiation you come up with. But you want to be investing in Drake because he's the best. You're almost guaranteeing a good outcome from your money. All right, and in the end, just one fact that we will sort of talk about, well, a lot more in the next lesson. And if you're using this as a revision video, then you'll know that Drake returns home with £400,000+ from one of his raids in 1580. Obviously, that's going to be really helpful for Elizabeth, particularly as relations against Spain and the plots are getting a bit more hairy, as we've said. He is a hero, national hero, stealing all that money. Now, remember how much Elizabeth can make in just a year with ordinary income, 286,000. So you can see just how much of a bounty this is, £400,000 plus. Obviously, again, though, Philip is going to be furious with this. What Elizabeth does next after he comes home with this money will make or break, will either make a war or end the war. And as you'll see shortly, Elizabeth goes some way to guaranteeing a war by knighting Drake publicly for this endeavour. Really putting two fingers up to Philip. Okay, so that's about £500 million today. It's a lot of money indeed. And also a little fact, if you wish, probably in a pub quiz when you're older, that Francis Drake is the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. This is just a bonus of his expedition, all right? So he's the first Englishman to travel around the world on his boat, and his boat is called the Golden Hind. That's another little pub quiz question that you might have one day. All right, so just pause the video and consider this little question in your book or wherever you're doing your notes. The idea of the robbing the money and everything that we've sort of said in the last page. Was this a particularly wise thing for Drake and Elizabeth to do, considering all of the other bits that are going on in the 70s and early 80s? Especially if you're doing this as a revision exercise, definitely write a nice little paragraph or write some bullet points or sentences to answer that question in a little bit of detail. I promise you, just taking the time to do that now in the context of this lesson as revision, or also to prepare for better revision later on if you're doing it the first time. Just take the time to understand the big picture, the context, what's going on right now that makes this decision to steal £400,000 not a wise thing to do. Okay, you really are poking the bear with this one, really are going to upset Philip, especially when by this point, you know, we've had Ridolfi. We know that the Throckmorton plot is going to be in 1583, so we know that tensions are really high between the Catholics. But yet, here we go. Elizabeth encourages and then promotes Drake to be knighted after this action. So was it wise? If it was, say why. There's obviously good reasons for doing it, obviously economical, but also consider in your notes here now why that might not be such a good idea. And then when you're ready, continue with this lesson. All right, so what does Drake's log tell us of his adventures? So he sets out with 5 ships, writes in his little log, leaves England, blah, 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 5 ships, but they only come home with 1 on this particular journey, 77 to 80, his own, the Golden Hind. Many attempts at mutiny on the ship, so clearly we can infer from that his sailors aren't overly happy with him. That's the only reason you'd have a mutiny against your captain or your leader. Something's obviously not gone well. Perhaps they've been away from home for too long. Maybe conditions aren't good. Maybe food supplies aren't so good. Maybe they're getting into trouble with the Spanish too much. Whatever it might be, there's some mutinies on the way. Drake manages to put down the mutinies, but he does execute one of his sailors. So overall, you could certainly decide that by 1580, by the time he gets home from this expedition, it wasn't so good. All right, but this is the map of his journey. You can see this expedition where he's managed to circumnavigate the globe, the first Englishman to do it. So he starts off in England, he comes down towards South America, absolutely getting into Spanish waters there. You can see at the bottom of South America at Tierra del Fuego, he is going in circles. Possibly that's where he's raiding some of those Spanish lands, stealing from them. Goes back up South America, over to North America, Mexico, and you can just see there at the top by North America as it sort of doubles up on himself, where he sets up Drake's Bay. Obviously, it's always good to name somewhere after yourself. Travels himself across through Hawaii into Australia, and then makes his way back up the Cape of Good Hope to Africa. Obviously, it's West Africa where the slave trade will be booming the most in the 18th century, and then back to England. So overall, 3 years away, he comes home with about 400 plus £1,000 of Spanish money, loads of stories, loads of supplies, probably loads of things to sell and trade. So despite the problems with his own crew by the looks of things and the loss of 4 ships, a relatively successful journey, and that is of course where Elizabeth will knight Drake for this expedition publicly on his ship. Just for interest's sake, if you really are interested, the Golden Hind, or a mock-up of it, you can go in London. If you're ever in London for a day out, you can go on the Golden Hind. It's a replica. Just get on the boat or one of the river cruises, or just get the train, and you can go on and see Drake's Golden Hind. Okay, it's just in London. I think it's by where the HMS Belfast is. So that might be quite nice for you to do as a little excursion, knowing the knowledge that we now have about Sir Francis Drake and his ship. So that's his little journey. Long, arduous, dangerous, but ultimately, overall, probably quite successful. So let's get some details about this journey, this expedition. Just copy them down into your book or into your notes, or wherever you're doing this now, with some detail. Extra detail is always good. We can use 2 or 3 of these things in a paragraph if necessary. So Drake and his crew survived by raiding Spanish ships and colonies. They're not just robbing money, they're robbing food and supplies, obviously. They kept detailed logs of information which will later, as we've said earlier, be shared with future expeditions and other sailors, so they know the dangers. They might know that this part of the Atlantic is really dangerous for weather, wind. This island might be really dangerous for pirates or Indians or anything like that. This information is going to be really important for future endeavours, easier to do with the printing press. Also, Drake lands in a bay to repair his ship. And this is treated with great hospitality by the Native American Indians. So initially, for now, certainly in this part of the Americas, Drake believes that the Indians are going to be friendly and not hostile. As we know, or as we can probably presume, that might not be the case all over America. Not all Native American Indian tribes might be quite so welcoming. However, Drake names that place where he lands to fix his ship Nova Albion, so New Albion, which is today San Francisco. So again, a nice little link basically to the Elizabethan course, that when we see these modern day names, that England's had a large part to play in that. He also declares Elizabeth I is the Queen of Nova Albion, thus technically becoming England's first colony in the New World. All right. Obviously, as you probably know anyway from your previous studies or just some general knowledge about the Native American Indians, how they are essentially going to be moved off their land for the great expansion west across the Americas. The Indians' feelings were not necessarily considered by this. This is England's land now, England flag planted in the ground. This now belongs to England, regardless of who's living there before. So this is another sort of issue. But we'll talk about the Native American Indians in another couple of lessons too, because that is quite important in why our proper attempts to colonize, to move over to the Americas, wasn't necessarily entirely successful at first. Okay, so when Drake returns, as we've said, she knights him. Elizabeth knights him on board the Golden Hind. Philip II is furious. He regarded Drake as nothing more than a pirate. He's furious at Elizabeth. He blames Elizabeth for paying for Drake to do this. So when we are thinking about this relationship breakdown, this has got to be absolutely fundamental in any answer that you come to why the war happened. Why did England go to war with Spain, or why did Spain go to war with England? Francis Drake is absolutely a paragraph, has to be a paragraph. Really, whether you like it or not, you need to make sure you are confident with some detail on Sir Francis Drake. Okay, we'll talk about whether it's a 12 marker or 16 marker shortly, but this stealing £400,000 from Philip and then being knighted for it, you can see why that might instigate a retaliation. All right. As we've also mentioned briefly in this lesson, that these stories of the explorers that Drake brings home and Hawkins brings home encourages other people to go on the voyages. Stories like the Native American Indians, they eat their own sick. gold, silver, riches everywhere. Honestly, if you go there, you'll be richer than you've ever imagined. Just things like that are not quite the same thing as boring old peasant land farming the fields. So this is what encourages people to go, or the nobility, the noble children. They hear these stories and they're like, they want to go and see this. It is really quite an exciting time, really, for history, human history as well, especially the beginnings of the expansion to the Americas later on. All right. Also on this expedition, we've gathered loads of information about the Americas. We know where there are perhaps hostile tribes, American Indians. We know where perhaps there are tribes more friendly. We know where might be a good place to colonize. All sorts of information is being recorded. Where's the weather not so hot? Where's there maybe dangerous places to set up colonies? All of this stuff, these early voyages in the 70s, will play a part later on, and of course well into the 17th century. Even though the Tudor period ends, the Stuarts will pick this up as well. And of course the Pilgrims, the Puritans that we mentioned when we talk about the Puritan lessons, they will in the 17th century make their way over to America as well, as they feel England is just too Catholic, too popish, or just not Puritan enough for them. So this information is going to prove invaluable going forward. And then also boosted confidence in the English sailors and in Elizabeth, really, that these formidable Spanish weren't actually impossible to beat. It was possible to defeat the Spanish in battles. So their confidence grew up. Maybe their confidence or their willingness to attack was a thing. All right, so let's just take a step back now. So once we get through this slide now, just write the title in your notes, but also just pause the video after we've finished, or as we go, or maybe rewind it a little bit, just to take the time to fully understand the significance of Drake, be it in the context of why and how did people able to go and explore, or be it in the context of the steps to war with Spain. So damaged English-Spanish relations, that's definitely going to be a hub of everything going forward now. Positive in encouraging future and further explorations, and encourages the idea that England could, in fact, build colonies in the Americas and begin competing with Spain, not just for trade, but also for that word empire. Okay, so this is the significance of Drake. We'll just put these small bullet points on, just have a little look at them and add them as a summary exercise now, as a little mind map as you end this topic, to fully understand why Drake is so important. So relations worsened as Drake has attacked Spanish ships. We know that. We know also that Elizabeth knighted Drake for this, £400,000. We know that, but just as a little summary exercise, make sure you've nailed that bit. And secondly, the exploration is encouraged. The logbooks give loads of information for future explorers, future journeys, future expeditions. I thought that Drake might have reached modern Vancouver. Obviously, we know that Vancouver is named after Vancouver from Kes. If you are watching this from our school, just down the road. So loads of links there to the Kingsland area, the local area as well. And then obviously the encouragement of these colonies. We've got some nice, I suppose for want of a better term, friendly American tribes. We've settled at Nova Albion in modern day California. This suggests that it's possible to set up colonies over there and even rule there in Elizabeth's name, that flag in the ground. And then Drake returns from the Americas with wealth and reports that encourage other explorers to continue to build settlements there, in the idea that there's so much wealth, silver, gold, and other really, really valuable things out in America. So just take a minute to pause, have a little read of these things, and make sure you're really confident on these three areas related to Drake. And then I feel like you should be good for any question where Drake is a possible answer. So this is, as always, just a little summary from our textbook that we use in school, just to make sure there's some little activities and checkpoints if you need to strengthen your information, and some activities. So once again, thank you very much for listening to this lesson. Hopefully it's proved useful, and along with the other lessons, all of which are, remember, on our website at www.stchistory.com in the Year 10-11 section, with all other online lessons and other resources. Or if you're watching this from Google Classroom because you've missed a lesson, check out the resources that are in there too. So some images of the ships and maps to stick in as well. If you have any questions, as always, please let your teacher know. And we will see you next time for the next lesson. Thank you very much and goodbye.